It's my great privilege to introduce Caesar McDowell, who will introduce today's speakers and moderate the discussion. It's a sort of return of a favor because Caesar introduced me yesterday. I'm David Thorburn, the director of the MIT Communications Forum. I should say how pleased I am that the forum has been able to involve itself in an event that involves such central civic questions for our local community. And I hope it's the first of other such events that MIT as an institution and the Communications Forum are able to participate in. Caesar McDowell is the director of the Center for Reflective Community Practice at MIT. Caesar.
Good morning, everyone. Do I have to get you up doing some stretches, exercises, things like that? We'll get into it. It's great to be here, and I'm not going to spend much time kind of situating things, but get right to the speakers. But I want to say a couple of things. The psychologist Frantz Fanon wrote in his book, The Wretched of the Earth, one of his quotes in his books is that, a community can only evolve when it controls its own communications. And one of his points in making that is that the ability of people to communicate, to connect with each other is an essential component of their ability to build a kind of a good life together with each other, and a life that really allows them to kind of form what we consider, really healthy communities. And today we're continuing this process about what has changed in communications in our society and in our age, and how might that impact the way we think about communities really being able to be healthy and their ability to build democratic, and our ability to build democratic communities. And I want to frame with just one little thing that I think we often forget. Most of us in our heads, when we think about democracy, when we think about communities working, we have kind of in our mind the notion of the New England town meeting. For us, that's what democracy is, right? It's a set of people being able to come to a forum like this, speak their piece, being considered in their thoughts, and then somehow good judgment comes out of that. And for us as Americans and people in this country, that's really an image that is driven over and over and over again into our mind. But I think it's important to kind of unpack that image around three very central dimensions. One is that model was based on a time in which people lived in communities that were mostly defined by communities of faith. People moved to places, they lived in places because people had certain sets of beliefs that they were organized around. Two, those communities were very clear about who were members of the community and who were not. Just because you lived within the context of the community did not make you a member of that community. And three, those communities tended to be very monolithic in terms of their cultural components. But that's not what society is today, and that's not what community is today. People live in communities mainly for economic reasons, for educational reasons, for relationships to jobs. Not about a shared sense of values, not about a sense of who's in and who's out, except for some of our gated communities and some of our suburban things. We can say that we've held on to that part of what community is. And not because we have kind of shared cultural context. So all the ingredients that kind of drove the model of what we think democracy means and what it looks like and how communication happens in democracy are all gone. They're all different now. And we haven't really forged new ways of thinking about that and kind of new models that let us kind of rest some sense of assurance that somehow this thing is working. Our three guests today are people who are working in different spheres of society and community and technology, really kind of looking at, I think, different aspects of that. Both aspects of what I would call place, public space, and kind of virtual space, and how they impact our sense as citizens and as people to have voice in the world. Our first speaker is Mitch Resnick, and Mitch is a professor at the Media Lab, where he co-founded the Computer Clubhouse and network of after-school learning centers where youth from underserved communities learn to express themselves with new technologies. It's really weird to read something about somebody I know. I should just turn to him and say it. That felt really weird, like, who's that guy? And after Mitch, I'm going to I'll just introduce everyone, and then I'll let them just come up and do their talk. Richard O'Brien is an assistant professor of political science at Northeastern University, where he really works in the areas of technology and public policy, and his interest is really around internet and public participation in democracy. And Richard, like Mitch, old friends. And Keith Hampton is also a colleague, and he's assistant professor of technology and urban and community sociology. He's in the Department of Urban Studies, where we both teach. And his research interests focus on the relationship between information and community technologies, social relations, and the urban environment. So we're going to go with Mitch first, and then Richard, and then Keith. And then after they all come up, we're going to open it up for general discussion and dialogue. Go ahead. Yeah. I think they need it for the cast. You also can say, "Good morning, Mitch." Good morning, Mitch.
Yeah.
Good, thanks.
So I was going to talk a little bit about this project that Caesar mentioned in the introduction called the Computer Clubhouse Project, which is a project that we started 10 years ago. We just celebrated the 10th anniversary. It is a network of after-school centers for young people from low-income communities where they learn to express themselves creatively with new technology. And as the title of the talk indicates, a main focus there is it's not just about access to new technology, but allowing young people to express themselves in new ways, to become fluent with the technologies. To give you a sense of what the project is about and how it's helped in changing lives of young people and the way they relate to their communities, I was going to use my 10 minutes or so just to tell some stories about youth from over the last 10 years at the Computer Clubhouse Project. In fact, I was going to start with the story of how the whole project got started. Because it was a little over 10 years ago, in our group at the Media Lab just across the way here at MIT, we've done a lot of work of developing new technologies to help young people learn things in new ways. And one project we were just getting started on back 10 years ago was a project with the Lego toy company. And we were developing these, what we came to call programmable Lego bricks. This is a current version of it. It's a little computer that kids could build into their Lego constructions. This later became a commercial product from Lego called Lego Mindstorm, some of you might have heard of. But then last 10 years ago, we were just getting started working on this, and we wanted to test it out with some kids. So we arranged with the local museum during one of the vacation weeks. We knew a lot of kids would be coming into the museum, and we thought it would be great to give them some of the prototypes, see what they did with it. So kids got some of these prototypes. They built things. I'll just show you a little example. They would build things like this. This is an example of some little creatures the kids built with a little computer they'd build inside. Most of it's traditional Lego bricks. They'd build this new Lego brick, a type of computer inside. And the kids would then program them to behave in different ways. In this case, they programmed them so when they saw each other, they would do a little dance. If you block them so they can't see each other, they stop dancing. When they see each other again, they start dancing again. So kids use these to build all sorts of things, not just little creatures, but kids build things like their own amusement park rides and an automated chocolate factory and all sorts of things. But at the end of the week, school vacation week was over. We took the technology. We brought it back to MIT. We thought it was over. But the next week, I get a call from the director of education at the museum. And she said, you know what? After school, the kids are coming back. And they're saying, where's the Lego stuff? And she went and talked to the kids. And these were kids, first of all, they didn't have money to get into the museum. So they were sneaking in. And as she talked to them, she found that these were kids who were getting into trouble outside of school. They were having trouble in school. And yet they wanted to come back and keep working on this project, which we saw as this learning rich project. But as we looked around, we wanted to see, well, where could these kids go? And there weren't places for them to go. There were community centers where the kids could go after school. And in fact, some of the community centers even had some computers 10 years, even 10 years ago, they had them. But the way they used the computers, you could go in and you could play some games, or you could sign up for a course to learn how to use a spreadsheet. But you couldn't use the computer to express yourselves creatively, to build these constructions with new technologies, or to create your own animations, or do things with videos. So the things that kids really wanted to do, that we saw as real learning opportunities, just weren't available for them. So these kids were just getting into trouble outside of school afterward, instead. So we saw a real crying social need and also an opportunity to help share some of the ideas that we really cared about that we thought could make a difference. So we started the first computer clubhouse. And in fact, one of the first kids who came into the clubhouse, the first clubhouse was started with the Computer Museum, which actually has since merged with the Museum of Science. But that very first clubhouse, when we opened it up, one of the first kids that came in was a kid named Mike. And Mike had dropped out of high school. He'd never used a computer before, but a friend suggested he come. And one of the things that Mike loved to do was drawing. He had notebooks full of different drawings that he had done. And in fact, that's generally what he was doing instead of paying attention in class, which is probably why he was no longer in school. But Mike had a real talent for drawing, and he loved doing it. So when he came into the clubhouse, part of our philosophy was we want kids to learn how to express themselves, and we want them to build on things that they really care about, build on their own interests. So since he cared about drawing, we showed him how we could take some of his drawing and bring it onto the computer. And first, he just took a small step. He would sketch on paper, scan it into the computer, and just use the computer for coloring in his drawings. This is one of the first things that he did. So as one of his drawings, he did just use the computer with a little paint bucket to do it, and it was easier for him to color it that way. So he was happy. Over time, over the next couple weeks, he started to see how he could use the computer to start adding new elements to his drawing that he couldn't do before. So this is what he did a few weeks later. We were starting to introduce text with the drawing, layering things that would have been very difficult otherwise. But then the most important thing that happened was not what happened to his drawing, but what happened to Mike's role within the community at the clubhouse. Because other kids started to notice what he was doing, and they were really excited by what Mike was doing, and they came to him for advice. They said, "Can you help us learn to draw that way?" In fact, this next image is one that was created by some other kids who had gone to Mike for advice, and you can see they started to draw in what they called the Mike Lee style. So it looks almost like Mike's drawings, but they really had learned from him, got advice from him, and were able to then start producing things in the Mike Lee style. But for Mike, this had a profound impact, because for Mike, no one had ever looked up to him before. No one had come to him for advice before. And in fact, he started even changing his own artwork, because some young kids started copying what Mike was doing, and Mike's early images had a lot of guns and knives and other gang imagery. And when he saw 10-year-olds doing that, he said, 10-year-olds, they shouldn't be doing that sort of stuff. So he changed his own artwork because he realized that he was being a role model for these younger kids that were part of the clubhouse community. So for the first time, Mike started to see himself differently of his role in the community and his own possibilities of how he could be a contributor to that community. Over time, Mike's artwork evolved. These are images, some of himself. He'd start to do collages. I think he started to express some of his own, make political statements through his art. This is one where he put a lot of his heroes on one wall of this museum, because you notice he has the person staring at the blank wall instead, which I think is Mike communicating somehow how he felt the rest of society was viewing him or the things that he found important. Over time, Mike was able to get his high school equivalency through the work he was doing. He later got a job at a local company helping with graphic design at their website. This is something he did at a local company. So partly there's a story how Mike was able to gain some skills that got him a job, but more important to me was how Mike started to see himself differently, see his role differently. I've always liked, there's a line from John Dewey, the great philosopher and educator, where he said, the purpose of education is not learning how to make a living, but learning how to make a life. And of course, learning to make a living is important, but I think what was even more important for Mike was learning how to make a life, of what role he was going to play in his community. And this is something that we've seen as the clubhouse has grown over the years. We stayed at the first clubhouse. We spent a few years with that, and we gathered. There was a community of kids that gathered around it. Some that would come in every day, some just once in a while. And they really made it their clubhouse. And based on that, we opened a few others at Boys and Girls Clubs in Boston. We then got a big grant from Intel to open lots of them. So we now have more than 80 of these clubhouses, mostly in the United States, but also starting to spread around the world, all of them in low-income communities, working together with a local community-based organization that understands the community. But we work with them to help them understand how they can use technology to help kids like Mike be able to see themselves differently and see their role in the community differently. Let me just end up, if I could take another couple minutes, to show one more short story of another of the clubhouse members here in Boston. There's a kid named Vladimir, and we'll follow Vladimir through the day and show a little bit about the type of things that Vladimir was doing in the clubhouse and some of the ways that it was affecting him in his life. We have audio?
It gives them an alternative than going out in the streets and misbehaving. In my community, basically what I see is like, we call them hood rats because they always get in trouble and always like picking on people and stuff. They're always in trouble, always. Most of the hood rats, they don't even know about the computer clubhouse. So I come here to get away from them. My brother, right, when he was my age, he was getting into a lot of stuff. It's like whatever happens to him happens to me. And my mother doesn't want that to happen, so she basically worries about me when I'm out late.
When he comes home, he's happy, he's excited, and he's trying to explain to me what he did. I don't know really anything about computers. And I look at his work, and, you know, I'm really, you know, surprised that he can do this and thrilled. But the biggest part is the joy, you know, that he's giving out, because this is something he really, really enjoys.
The very first thing I did on the computer, right, is took a picture of myself, scanned the picture on a computer, and I
kids put themselves into the computer, get images of themselves.
For many of the youth growing up in today's inner city, these technological tools, they know about them. They see them on television, but it's someone else's world. At the Clubhouse, these new technologies come in and become part of their world.
My idea of computers before I really got to use them was a utensil that adults use, but I see I was wrong about that. All the other mentors, they say that, like, I ahead of myself, like, with doing projects, discovering stuff. Like, that's kind of surprising to me, because I just think myself as a normal person.
All right, I'll stop there, but I hope that gives you at least a few snapshots to get a sense of the ways that technology can enter kids' lives. That too often we see that the way technology is presented today is either just through entertainment, playing games, or just through getting, look up something to get some information you need. Again, both of those are useful. There's nothing wrong with that. What we've tried to do with the Clubhouse is let kids see themselves as designers and creators with technology, where it's a tool for them to express themselves with. And we've seen that that's really a pathway that really helps kids develop as creative, capable, and confident learners. And also stronger members of a community where they see how they can contribute and how they can become more meaningful participants in the communities they live in. Thanks a lot.
One, two, check.
Good morning. I'm going to first talk to you a little bit about my research project that I did while here at MIT. My colleague and Randall Pinkett, some of you may be familiar with the Canfield Estates project, where we got a housing development, got some funding, got some computers, secured internet access, and got residents to participate in a study for the total study was about 2 years, and we interviewed them, collect data, and so forth during that time. And the things that we were interested in were the signs or indicators of whether or not technology would help contribute to things like community building, residents' ability to be self-sufficient, whether or not they were able to increase their communications with friends, family, with members of their community, whether or not they could access information on their own that they traditionally would need support or services to help them do. And so what I'll do is I'll show you this video from our study first, and then get into a discussion about where and the direction that my research interest has taken me as a result of some of the stuff that we found at Canfield.
What the technology, coupled with good planning, helps us to do is realize the potential mistakes before they happen.
there is a social stake in technology, that people are affected by technology, whether if it's a local community or whether if it's a large company.
What I asked them was how many residents were English speaking and how many were strictly Spanish speaking.
The gap between the information haves and the information have-nots is growing. Certain groups are adopting technology at a much faster rate than others. If you look at those who are adopting more slowly than the general population, you find it's minorities, you find it's low-income residents, you find it's those in urban settings.
One graduate student's working with some folks over in the Media Lab to help housing developments in the city to experiment with the use of computing in order to facilitate communication among the residents.
So we're looking to do a study of technology in a low-income community, providing computers, high-speed internet connectivity for the residents of a housing development here in Roxbury, Massachusetts.
From here all the way down.
I'm working very closely with the Planning Support Systems Group with my advisor, Mitchell Resnick, Joe Ferreira, and one of his doctoral students, Richard O'Brien.
We're looking at how the technology helps to see if residents become more involved, not only in residential issues, but in issues in the surrounding neighborhoods. So you able to do any personal stuff, like if you wanted to shop or things?
I'm not. That's what I was talking about. I want to get digital, and in terms of like paying bills, and my use of the computer is relegated to like work. I really don't have a chance to really just do personal stuff. I plan on putting the computer here once I clear this out. I got it. And I made some space for it. This is my. See, I got a really elaborate filing system right here.
Job listings, are they going to be updated regularly, or is it?
We formed a resident subcommittee to help oversee implementation, which includes residents, representatives of the Tenants Association. We're also working with residents to help co-design some of the software, co-design the website.
We're trying to establish an intellectual infrastructure as well as the technology infrastructure so that they'll be able to come up with some ideas on how they themselves can use the technology.
Like I said, do everything on the computer, from work, from schoolwork. I do a little bit of writing. I used to write for my school paper. I spent some time at the Boston Globe, did some writing for an online company. Make it a lot easier for me to submit articles that way. I'd be able to jump right on, zap it in, send it off. Personal things, hopefully paying bills online. Run the whole gamut of things that you're able to do.
We can hopefully engage residents in building their own websites, sharing recipes, sharing information, connecting with each other, connecting with the larger community. We want to certainly encourage residents to be producers of content as opposed to passive recipients.
Email communication, community organizing, improved management, improved connection to the city is the sort of thing that can now be contemplated.
We're also looking at if they have more information about the things that are going on in the world, do they feel like they have the ability to make a change or have a voice in the process of change? Now, what I'll do, I won't spend a whole lot of time going through a lot of the specifics on the project and some of the stuff we found, because we can talk about that. But what I think is most intriguing about this project is that the population that we worked with is the population that the digital divide has identified as the least likely to be involved or participating with the technology. And what we found is that once the residents were able to develop a level of comfort with the technology through the training, through the support, then they were able to use the technology on a fairly regular basis. Now, the housing development, Canfield Estates, was going through a series of changes while this project was going on. So a number of things that have occurred that may not necessarily be able to be solely attributed to the technology. However, I think it's important to note that this community, during the life of this project, became stronger. Residents communicated more. They shared more information within the community, outside of the community. But what is also interesting is that they were able to begin to do more from their home, where they traditionally had to go outside of their home or outside of their community to do, and using a third party or a service or an agency to do. Now, this is a quote from one of the residents that will sort of give you an indication of how they saw it as being important and what it meant to them and their family as a resource. Now, as a result of what I found at Camfield, my interest in being at the Department of Political Science at Northeastern University is to begin to investigate further this relationship between people who have internet access and their participation, in particular political participation. And there's a body of research that's emerging that is really looking at how the internet is beginning to play a role in the political process. Much of it is as a result of what occurred in the 2000 election. A lot of people are looking at alternative ways to prevent some of the voting problems that occurred during the 2000 election. And voting over the internet is one that has become a very strong subject of discussion in recent years, not without its challenges, but it's looking to sort of solve some of the democratic problems or process problems that occurred from the 2000 election. So one of the people that has done a study in relation to this is a professor named Caroline Tolbert at Kent State University, where she looked at the American National Election Studies data set to begin to look at those people who voted or those people who accessed election information online and had internet access, and see if there's a relationship between that and them actually voting. And so she looked at the Pew study that showed that 22% of internet users would look at information that was political in nature. But the crux of the argument, some have suggested that despite the flexibility and ease by which you can use the internet, that what probably will occur is that those who were already predisposed to vote or participate will do the same on the internet. But this is one of the things that Professor Tolbert found from the study of the data set, that in fact what the Pew study had found is in fact true, that more people who are online are beginning to look at and access information as it relates to politics. But what she did find was that when she controlled it, white females with internet access showed an 84% higher probability of voting if they had access election information online. But what is interesting is that when they looked at all the races without regard to income, that it was consistent, that there was more participation from all the different groups that had internet access. But some of the other problems still remain, where African Americans are least likely to have internet access, and it raises concerns about some of the democratic theory as it relates to internet as a medium for freedom of speech. Because if everybody doesn't have access, then you're looking at some of the challenges and issues that she's raising. So what I'm looking to do with my research is, there are a number of developments that were involved with the demonstration disposition program with Canfield Estates. We're looking to approach the National Science Foundation to begin to study political participation in low-income communities, and trying to see if there's a relationship between those low-income residents that have internet access and those that don't, and whether or not they become politically involved. So with that, I'll leave it for discussion when we get to that. Thank you. I'll let you do that, Keith. I don't want to screw it up. Oh.
All right. Good morning. Topic of my work is a little bit different from what you've heard this morning. I have two particular focuses. One is a general concern about how new information and communication technologies, such as the internet, are affecting social relationships and community. And the second is a more particular focus at looking at how we can build new technologies to build stronger communities, build social capital, to build connections. And when I talk about using these technologies to build connections, I generally look at the neighborhood level, and I generally don't look at low-income communities. In general, my work deals with more middle-class communities, largely because in a natural research setting, they have better access to technology right now, and it makes it easier for me to study. I don't provide communities with technology or anything like that. I'm far more interested in what happens in a natural setting. So I'm going to talk briefly about three projects: a past project, the Netville project, something that's going on right now called e-neighbors, and a little bit of talk about a project that's just starting up called network awareness. Now, my work takes a slightly different perspective as well, and then I take a social network perspective. I argue that by looking at social relationships online and neglecting offline relationships, or vice versa, we're missing about half the argument. So many people argue, for example, that people go online, interact in virtual communities, and then they go offline and they interact with their friends and family. They neglect to realize that friends and family can interact online, and relationships that you form online can then move offline. That people use multiple methods of communication. They don't just use email. They don't just meet in person. They use the phone as well, and so on. And that these relationships actually vary considerably in tie strength. There are about 12 or so strong ties in the average person's social network, and about 1,500 weak social ties. And most studies about new technologies and how they impact community have focused on those 12 or so strong ties and neglected that majority of 1,500 weak social ties that turn out to be very valuable. In fact, weak social ties, particularly if they're very diverse in the types of people that they access, are those types of social ties that are valuable for things like finding job information, getting access to information and resources that you can't get from the rest of your social network, because those 12 strong ties are so highly interconnected that they all have the same information anyway, and they're not very useful for providing new jobs and new information. Now, the Netville study was a 3-year study that took place a number of years ago now, where I moved to a suburb for 2 years, lived there, and we gave them a whole bunch of technology: broadband internet access, video phones, neighborhood email lists, multimedia chat rooms, something like Napster so they could share music files, online access to healthcare professionals, everything that we could possibly think of. And of course, the most exciting part was that they didn't use any of it, except for the neighborhood email list. It was the most popular function and by far the most interesting in terms of how it impacted very local social ties. So one of the things we found was that if we compared the wired and the non-wired residents inside this very wired suburban community, we found that the wired residents visited about 50% more often. They were they recognized, I think, about 4 times as many as their neighbors, and they talked to their neighbors about twice as often. And this is in the same community, randomly assigning wired people and non-wired people. So just to make sure that what we observed in Netville wasn't unique, wasn't caused by the sociologists living in the basement, or the fact that it was just a very unique field site at a time when ubiquitous broadband internet access was a very new and exciting thing, we're replicating this now in the greater Boston area. We have 4 field sites that were selected to be diverse in the type of neighborhoods they were: an apartment building, a gated community, 2 suburbs, one of which we're using as a control group. So we've gone in, we've interviewed people now for 2 years. We're getting ready for the 3rd year. We've interviewed them about how technology is influencing their life. And 3 of those 4 neighborhoods, we gave some very simple technologies: neighborhood email lists, things that introduce them to neighbors who they have things in common with, who they didn't know before. And we're very interested in how those technologies are then impacting neighborhood social relationships and relationships in the rest of their social network. That's just a quick view of what the eNeighbors website looks like. It's nothing spectacular. In fact, it's meant to be very simple in terms of the type of technology that we're providing. And technology that doesn't require someone to go into each neighborhood and train residents on how to use it or train them on how to become neighborly. But in fact, based on the idea that if we just plop this down, that there will be some sort of self-organizing principle, and that those few people in almost every neighborhood that are very involved will start to get other people involved. So some of the early findings, when we look at people's social networks in our e-neighbors for field sites, when we look at their social networks beyond the neighborhood setting, we find that of the 313 people that we interviewed, together they have 4,258 strong ties, an average of 13.6 each, only 2.5 of which are at the neighborhood level. Of those 4,258 social ties, only 4 of them originated through internet communication. Pretty strong evidence that internet relationships don't become strong social ties. We found that face-to-face contact actually reduces those who have a lot of face-to-face contact have smaller strong tie social networks, simply because it takes a lot more effort to maintain social ties in person than it does through telephone and so on. So those who are using a lot of face-to-face contact just don't have the time to invest in larger strong tie social networks. What's that? Well, that's a good question. Is face-to-face contact better than email contact? I would actually argue that, in fact, it doesn't matter so much, that they're actually good for providing different types of information and support. And, in fact, what we found is that face-to-face contact, it's great, but email contact leads to phone contact. And phone contact leads to face-to-face contact. So they're not actually mutually exclusive. When we look at the diversity of people's social ties, they're weak social ties. What we find is that web use, although not email use, those people who do a lot of web surfing tend to have less diverse social ties, a smaller number of weak social relationships. But television is a whole lot worse for you. You can spend, almost twice as much time online as you can watching television and have the same negative effect on your social network. Years online or internet experience has some positive effect in reversing this trend. And telephone is the big social network saver. A little bit of telephone calling to your social network goes a whole long way in terms of providing support and increasing the diversity of your social ties. Now, at the neighborhood level, now I apologize for this being so small. I was hoping it would be bigger. Inside e-neighbors, our field sites, when they started out and we gave them this technology, the neighborhood email list, for about a year, the only thing that took place online was people asking, does anyone know where I can find a good plumber? Does anyone know where I can find a good roofer? Can you recommend a babysitter? Does someone know where I can get my car fixed? And we're talking literally hundreds of these messages over a year-long period. Not very exciting, but very interesting types of social support and referral networks that were going on within inside the local community. What's interesting is that sometime this summer, all that changed. Someone discussed local politics. And suddenly, the number of messages skyrocketed. Everybody started talking about local politicians, local governance, local services. And as you can see from this email list, it brought up a huge debate about the impact that this was going to have on them as a local community and on the use of this list. And their conclusion was that this technology made communicating about these things very easy. And ever since then, now there's a nice division between who needs a plumber and talking about local politics, including setting up a number of local petitions, petitioning the local government for changing a bus route, people putting petitions on their doors, people handing out placards, you name it, they were starting to do it inside their local community. So some of the early findings at the neighborhood level. From those we provided the e-neighbor services, 16% of them reported having sent a personal email to a neighbor who they did not know prior to having these services. 12% of users met a neighbor in person that they did not know before. 9% started talking on the phone with a neighbor they did not know before. 12% reported an increase in neighborhood safety. 29% reported that it increased neighborhood involvement. And 43% reported that it increased their ability of their community to react in the face of an emergency or a problem. Now, in Netville, we saw this happen a number of times. When the houses started to fall apart, brand new community, they organized together very successfully online and petitioned the local government to stop further developments by this developer in their community. They petitioned the developer himself to move a customer service trailer inside the neighborhood to address their problems. So the technology really breaks down existing barriers of social contact and enables things like collective action, which are very good for weak social ties. Now, of course, one of the most interesting findings here is that no strong ties, no new strong ties inside the neighborhood setting as a result of these services. Just a whole lot more weak social ties. To wrap things up, I'll talk just very briefly about the Network Awareness Project. Previously, my work has dealt with wires, primarily wires coming into people's home. But of course, the growth of wireless technology is very much the future. cell phones, Wi-Fi devices. And examples of how these technologies are changing the way we interact include things like flash mobs, cell phones used at protest movements in order for collective action. Something that I've been referring to as networked individualism, and other people have been referring to that as well, where people form ad hoc communities around themselves in the place that they're at rather than traditional places of home and workplace. Now, there was a really interesting article in the Boston Globe last weekend about this, for teens with cell phones at Instant Party. And it quoted this poor police officer in this neighborhood who was reminiscing for the old days when kids hung out in parking lots, because at least then he could have pretty good surveillance and find out where the local party was going to be that weekend. But now he couldn't find them because they were all at home, and then they'd call each other up on the cell phones, and parties would just spring up spontaneously, and it was very disruptive for the local police. So will the ability to use these new wireless technologies in different ways in terms of community change how we think about place? Will it lead to a loss of serendipity of urban interactions, increased privatization where people are spending more time in their homes, less in their community? Will it change how we access social support? In particular, I'm very concerned about position-aware technologies, and these are often referred to as E911 technologies. And it's the ability of cell phone companies to track the location of cell phones as they move through space. So cell phone providers have always been able to find out where your cell phone is, roughly. They can now do it a whole lot better, to within about 5 meters or so. And of course, governments like this. It's a great surveillance tool. If it's an emergency, they can find you easy. Cell phone operators love this because they can send you spam as you walk past Starbucks and say, here's a coupon, please come in. And consumers, for the most part, are relatively unaware that this technology even exists. So the question is, how can we use this technology to build community, encourage interactions in very local urban environments? Well, I think we can use it to reinforce existing social ties, that is, build up solidarity amongst people you already know, increase new interactions, afford social diversity, meaning introduce you to people who you might not have had contact with before, increasing social contact, increasing social tolerance, increasing access to resources that you might not previously have had access to, and possibly even reverse a decline of serendipity in urban interactions. So what we did this summer is we created this toy called Ubi, which is just a little Java applet that loads onto your cell phone. And when you walk down the street, it tells you when your friends are nearby. It tells you when your friends are nearby. And it tells you people who are, example, in common groups. So it would tell me when other people in my department are maybe within a certain distance. It doesn't tell you exactly where they are, because we do have some privacy issues here. But it does tell you that there's someone who you might want to meet nearby. And the idea is this will encourage some sort of serendipity. It would also allow you, as an audience in this lecture hall, to take out your cell phones or your Wi-Fi laptops and say, well, is there a group right here? And you'd be able to chat behind my back on your cell phones and on your laptops, and you'd be able to preserve that group over time. So the next time you walk down the street and you pass Starbucks, whatever, you can say, hey, there's 3 people who are at that lecture in Starbucks right now. Do I want to go in and say hello? So just to wrap it up, a couple of things I want to bring out of this. New technologies do not cause social change. They actually just afford social interactions by breaking down existing barriers to social contact. The internet should not be just treated as a separate social domain. It's very much part of our existing social networks. And while there may be a reduction in the friction of space, and that new technologies allow us to communicate across great distances much easier than we could before, place is still important. And that's about it. Thank you.
Yes, my name is John Pickett. I have a very practical question for Keith Hampton about the neighborhood email devices. Out of school for one time. One of the boring issues we always do with it is about being out of names and numbers. Can you explain how that works, please? Sure.
So what we've done is we set up basically an all-inclusive
situation where if people are aware of the website, go up to the website, very, very easy for people to do that.
Is there an anonymous mode too that you can just send to everybody in your neighborhood? Repeat the question.
Oh, of course. Okay, so John's wondering how do we handle issues of privacy? So there are some concerns about giving
out the email address of everybody inside your neighborhood and making that information publicly available. And what we do is we make it very much an opt-in service. We don't do anonymous because there are some experiments we've done in the past where that's proven to be a little bit ugly. We also very much limit the size of our neighborhoods to about 200 homes. And what we find is that if it goes beyond that, or if it becomes anonymous, people forget that they're actually communicating with neighbors who live very close to them and often say things that you wouldn't want to say to a neighbor when you have to pass them in the street for the rest of your life.
Right down here.
So engrossed in the conversation.
I'm Henrietta Davis, and I'm Vice Mayor of the City of Cambridge, and like John, just ran for office and was communicating with a lot of people using many different methods. But one of the, it strikes me that running for office, you're creating a kind of a neighborhood of people also. I wonder just practically, what is this software and how do you get it?
We're getting ready for the public release of eNeighbors. Hopefully in the spring we'll have a website where you can show up, enter in your zip code, and it will identify online neighborhoods that are near you or allow you to create your own online neighborhood. And you can set up your own neighborhood email list and all the services that we've been providing to these existing neighbors.
In the spring?
In the spring, yeah.
Good.
Good.
Thank you.
Thanks, Henrietta.
Yeah, Phil Long. I was interested in the Canfield project. One of the findings seemed to be a decline in 20% in the use of the technology in the recent years over the several years that you were looking at it, and I'd be interested in your comments about that.
That was an interesting finding for us too, and at first it was a little concerning, but it was just around the website because the residents allowed us to keep weblogs. And so we collected data on who was using the website and how often it was being used. But what we were able to, after further analysis, begin to realize that once people reach a certain level of comfort with the technology and have found what they needed as it relates to the site, they would usually only come back when they actually needed something from the site or became familiar enough where they didn't have to continue to stay at the site. And once people became more comfortable with the technology and with internet use, that traffic began to go other places. So as opposed to staying at the Camfield site and what was specific to Camfield, they began to venture out into other areas of the internet. So the website drop in usage wasn't as troubling as we had initially thought because the weblog showed that people were going other places.
Do you have statistics on the overall technology use? So if the use of the website went down, but the overall use of the net, do you have statistics?
Yeah, if you saw the average was about 3.8 hours per day, with most of the participants saying they use the computer and the internet every day or almost every day. So that was showing that it wasn't consistent with the drop in the website, that usage was still high, although the website use had dropped.
Yes, and then we'll go to the
back. Hi, I'm Jeff. Excuse me. I was wondering if any of you could provide any insight into how the use of technology is affected by language barriers and how technology might be adapting or the use of technology might adapt to accommodate that.
Our particular project, that was one of the unexpected challenges that we came across because some of the residents were strictly Spanish speaking. And all of the Spanish translation software that we found was just not adequate. But in addition to that, we found that there was literacy challenges within the Spanish-speaking community. So even if you translated it, you still had to deal with the issue of them, whether or not they could actually read. And so that was one of the lessons that we learned. And in hindsight, we would probably take more time at the front end, identifying those residents that were strictly Spanish speaking, identify the kind of tools that would be adequate for them and address that issue accordingly. But that was the only language barrier that we have was Spanish to Spanish-speaking residents.
One issue that's come up for us, as I mentioned, our computer clubhouse network has expanded internationally. Actually, we're now in 17 countries. And we do have an intranet that connects members and staff at all the different clubhouses, which leads, on one hand, to some language barriers. On the other hand, it also contributes to new language opportunities. A lot of the members in U.S. cities don't have English as the first language, and it helps connect them to others. There's a lot of Latino youth here who are now speaking online with kids from the clubhouses in Costa Rica and Brazil and Colombia, opening up new possibilities for them, seeing the broader community they can be part of through that language. We also are, though, looking at different type of language translation that goes on, and it's still not very good for language translation, although we find with kids, a lot of times bad language translation is still good enough for supporting interesting communication going on.
No.
Back?
Yeah, my name is Jean. I'm interested about the Kempfield estate. Is these findings help increase the voter participation in the political process in Boston? And the second question is, the studies involve mostly African American or all of the ethnic groups?
I'll take the second part first. The Canfield Estates development is mostly African American, with a pretty good number of Hispanic and Spanish-speaking residents. But there were some whites and there were some Asians and there were some Native Americans in the development. But unfortunately, only the African American and Hispanic communities were the ones that participated in the project. And in relation to voting, that was one of the things that we did capture. And voting did increase during the life of the project, but it occurred during the time of the 2000 election, where voter participation increased everywhere. So that would not be a good indicator for the rest of other low-income communities in Boston. However, that is where my interest is taking me, to try and find out about voter participation in other low-income communities.
Hi, Robert Winters. I'd just ask if anyone could comment on it's really two facets. The positive aspect being that of how one or two people can really sway the ultimate results of any of these experiments. In other words, you can put the technology out there, but if in one little subset, like one school community, for example, in Cambridge, where one or two people really know how to make an email list work, they can become very organized, whereas another school may actually have nothing happening at all. In other words, it's not just the access to the technology, it's also some human beings that make it go. And the second side of this, sort of the negative side, is there's a lot of history of online communities being formed. I'm specifically thinking of things like Usenet groups, where there's this phenomenon of what they call the bad chasing out the good. What starts off as a very good community with a lot of representation ends up being dominated by some difficult, and people eventually throw their hands up and says, I'm out of here. So if anybody could comment on that side of things as well.
Well, I have a couple comments. The first is that in my particular work, we kind of operate under something called a threshold theory. And in Netville, what we observed was that there's always a couple people in any neighborhood who are going to get involved and who are going to say stuff. And if they're not, what it takes to get those people involved is observing other people who are involved. And the great thing about the neighborhood email list is that it's very visible. And if you see a couple people participating, you begin to think that there's more people participating than there really are. And it actually, it's like a domino effect. It really does start to increase participation. But it also works in the opposite effect. As soon as something bad happens and suddenly communication stops, it just stops. And that's it. And it's very hard to revive. We've also found in e-neighbors that there are just some neighborhoods where no matter what you do, unless you go in there and publicly intervene, you'll never get people involved. There are some neighborhoods that are already involved enough that they just don't want anymore. And then there's other neighborhoods that are, particularly transient neighborhoods that are younger tend to not want to be as involved. They have something to prove about their independence, and the fact that they're so transient, the attachment level goes down a little bit, and it's very hard to get them involved no matter what you do.
Let me just add on the point of a few people making a big difference. I mean, you allude to one example where there might be only one or two people who know how to set up the list and then it can take off. So that's a place where a few people with some technical knowledge can make a difference. And that's certainly true, but I'd want to make sure to add that we see a lot of cases where a few people make a difference, where it has nothing to do with the technology, but people who act as the social glue of the community, whether it's a proximal in-person community or an online community, playing a key role, or in a lot of things, the type of activities that we work on at the Clubhouse, where it's about creative expression, a few people with background in the arts who really know how to bring out the expressiveness of others can make a much bigger difference than people who know how to use the technology.
Yeah, and what we've found at Canfield is that those people who were active and involved, similar to what the voting study was talking about, were the ones who were really active and involved online. So board members, people who were more popular or more known. But for our purposes, it was a good thing because it helped to keep what little bit of activity going. And it helped to support the other residents that may have had a little nervousness or trepidation about using it to begin to become comfortable with it because these people continue to use it. I would say from a public standpoint, it would be consistent with the telephone, where public policy has been developed to ensure that everybody could have telephone access, which is why we have something like 96% telephone penetration rate. Whether or not technology or internet access will get to that, nobody knows. But I think the gist of your question about communication, I think public policy looks at it as something that is very valuable and needed in society, so that it's not a luxury, but it's something that people would require.
I believe it's a utility. I mean, it's like having plumbing. It's a public good. I mean, I think that not just municipal governments, but even federal governments have a responsibility to not only provide access, but to ensure that there is resources available to provide skills and training as well.
Mm-hmm.
Phil?
Here's the microphone. Give him the microphone.
I hold the mic. In the Computer Clubhouse study, Mitch, it seemed as though your introduction of technology really was focused around the individual's engagement with it and empowering them as a consequence of it, or perhaps improving esteem and creativity, et cetera. The other two seem to be much more about using the technology in a communication sense, perhaps more with people around them, but also as much with anonymous or third parties outside of the regular community. Were there any elements or spillovers between that interaction in the Computer Clubhouse context and the computer as a communications tool and its effect on the social structure or social interactions of the kids?
I'd break apart. We paid a lot of attention from the beginning on issues of social interaction and building of community. But we've paid more attention to that than the use of computers as the communication tool. So, I mean, both within the Clubhouse itself, it wasn't just about individual empowerment, but building the community within, as shown in the story about Mike and helping others. Increasingly, over the years, it's also been reaching outside the walls of the Clubhouse. There's a lot of work now with kids in Clubhouse doing work in the community to try to address challenges in the surrounding community of the Clubhouse. One of my graduate students, Leo Bird, has a project called the Young Activists Network, where young people at more than a dozen of the clubhouses work on projects of investigating the different issues around in their communities, mapping social networks in their communities, getting an understanding of how interactions happen in their communities, identifying problems and needs in their community, and then seeing how they can use technology to develop solutions to those problems. Up till now, most of the focus has not been on the use of communication technologies in doing that. It's been much more using digital cameras to document things, communication in the sense of making presentations to help convince other people about the problems, but hasn't been focused so much on using internet technologies, although we do have internet connecting the different clubhouses. It gets used by the staff to share ideas and best practices. It hasn't been at the core of what the activity in the clubhouse has been about.
John? Oh, thank you.
My name is John Garrity. I'm going to Professor Hampton, right? When you were talking about, say, phones, 96% of people have phones. You can go to a phone book and look up the phone numbers. You don't want to start calling, but say you had a Cambridge phone book. How about, you did it in a social, in a sort of a setting where you did a study setting, you had this community interaction. But for example, say you had a problem in Cambridge. I live in Linear Street. Say we had a problem with leaf blowers, for example, and you wanted to organize the community through email. How do you go about building up these lists? I mean, is there any source you could find out that get addresses, email, respecting to privacy, of course. But.
Yes. Well, hopefully in the spring you'll just be able to come to the eNeighbors website and say, I live here, and all these other people have provided their emails and signed up. If not,
people sign up.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, we have a function built in so you can email your neighbors who you know their email addresses, and hopefully kind of chain reaction. But there are many other examples across the country, in Canada, the U.S., Europe, where people have gone door to door and done that initial legwork to get the email addresses, and then it makes collective action easier over time, because right now the biggest barrier to collective action is the 25 feet between you and your neighbor's front door, and the effort it takes to move from door to door to door to door, and the energy required to do that, and the printing of the paper to get the signatures, and coordination, and all that is much easier over email.
I agree with you. That would be an explosive event.
Absolutely. That'd be great. I hope so.
Yeah. And there are some online utilities that you could search for email listings in your area. I believe AOL probably has it. I don't know. I'm not an AOL user, but a lot of the online utilities, if you wanted to be able to search for who has email or who has email with that utility in your area, you could find it. It may be. I don't know. I don't have Comcast.
I got it.
Yeah.
We have two more questions, and Dave, and then
David Thorburn. This is really a comment, although I'd be happy if the panelists had a quick response. One theme, one sort of undersong that I hear in some of the responses from the panel struck a especially resonant chord with me, and it's the undersong that says something like, "It's not the technology at all. Don't become a utopian about new technical possibilities, because certain older kinds of skills and understandings are important." I wanted simply to reinforce that and say something that's almost so obvious that we all take it for granted. People with very strong verbal skills who read fluently and easily master the internet much more quickly than people who have limited verbal skills. The truth of the matter is that the computer itself, although it's more than this, is also in a fundamental sense a tool like a typewriter, like a book for the exploitation of verbal or language skills. And one implication of this is that one of the strongest ways to empower people to use the internet and to use computers well is to teach them to read and write, and to strengthen what we might think of as the most old-fashioned technology, which is the technology of language itself. Words from an English teacher.
Actually, let me just point out a dilemma that we're facing right now that I'd be interested to hear your view on. We're setting up to strengthen this, we call it the Clubhouse Village, the intranet that connects members at these 80-some clubhouses. Right now we have the technology when members post a project. They do a type of graphic or animation, they put it there. Right now they type a little description of it. As you said, they could better communicate about it if they have the language skills to do it. Now we are able to have them just record a message about it, and others could just hear about it. And I think we have mixed minds about that. In some ways, I think it would be much more likely for people to reflect on their projects and add commentary to it when we have the possibilities of voice annotation. On the other hand, I think it will remove some of the way that, in fact, the internet has been serving in the clubhouse to have a motivation for learning more language skills, because that was the way initially with the internet to be able to describe your projects. So I think we're opening up to more forms of communication besides the written word.
No, I agree about that, Mitch.
And I think there's
fact,
a challenge in that.
Absolutely
we
right.
struggle with.
I did not mean. In fact, I would not undervalue oral skills at all.
Right,
I think that many people are much more eloquent when they speak orally than they are on the page, and it's good that the technology enables that. But both are verbal skills, both are language skills, and skill with language is still the heart of what it takes to be someone who uses computers well.
And I would add to that too. I sat on a panel at the Aspen Institute with some of the policymakers from the Federal Communications Commission, and they were asking the question about social justice and internet use and trying to get people machines. And I think to just focus on getting people a machine and getting people the internet access falls way short of what actually is needed. Just like Keith said, that training people to use this stuff and showing them how to make good use of it becomes the most important thing, because if you look at low-income communities, there's a lot of technology in low-income communities. Cell phone penetration rates is off the charts in low-income communities. A lot of the technology that you would be surprised or wouldn't think was there is already there, but they haven't seen the relevance or haven't gotten comfortable with a computer or the internet. And so they shy away from it. But if you show them how to use it, show them the value in it, they will make the provisions to get the technology that they need to do what they need to do. And so it's not so much focusing on just getting people machines, that you got to show people how to use it and make good use of it.
We have one more question from Mark, and then we're going to have to close up because we are way over our time.
Yeah, that's one of the reasons why I wanted.
Sorry to the next panel.
So my name is Mark Lloyd, and with Christina Rosen's help to pull this panel off. I wanted to thank all of you for sharing your Saturday morning with us, and wanted to ask you, put you on the spot just a little bit. I know that all of you have talked about your projects, and I don't know if you've made it explicit that you are not doing work in Cambridge, that you're doing work sort of in the maybe the greater Boston area or in Massachusetts, but not in Cambridge. Can you give us a sort of a reason why you are not doing work in Cambridge? And I'm sure there are practical scholarly reasons for it. And could you maybe provide some suggestion about how the work that you're doing and these other places would apply directly to Cambridge, particularly with our vice mayor here, who it's rumored to be the next mayor of Cambridge. So please, we're waiting for your advice. And again, thank you very much. So.
Well, thank you for putting us on the spot.
That's why.
Well, I have a mixed response. The reason we didn't choose a Cambridge neighborhood as a field site was because of the student factor. There's just so many of them, and they're transient. We didn't know what impact that would have on our study. We wanted something that was a little bit more normal. And the other response is that I live in Cambridge. I'm a housemaster on campus. And we're in a residential community that's very much dedicated to try and become more involved with the Cambridge community. And I think we've worked with Henrietta in the past on this, and Mitch and Caesar and I have talked about ways that we might be able to do more about integrating technology into some aspect of that.
I'd say with the Computer Clubhouse project, it's true that with the 80 or so clubhouses, none are in Cambridge. We have around a half dozen in Boston, one in Lawrence, one in Worcester, so there are a variety in the area. There's not a scholarly reason for doing it. It's been largely opportunistic. We've entered to open clubhouses where there's been a combination of a community organization that sort of shares the spirit and a funder who's willing to put in the funds for it. And it's happened other places, so we'd be happy to explore other places. But we've been opportunistic where the opportunity has arisen. In our group, we have done similar types of work in some of the schools in Cambridge, having done work in Cambridge Rindge and Latin at the Agassiz School, but just haven't had, with the clubhouse, haven't had the right opportunity.
The same reasons that they mentioned. We didn't really look in Cambridge, but it wasn't that we didn't want to. But some of the communities in Boston were a little more representative of urban areas across the country. And that's not to say that Cambridge doesn't have its challenges as an urban area, but Boston seemed a little more representative of that. But and the convenience of it. I mean, we use some of our personal connections to get into some of the housing developments because it's just not an easy barrier to break to get into a low-income community. There's a level of trust you got to develop, and you got to deal with some stakeholders that have some trust within the community. So that would be probably the most important reason, I would say, for our doing it in Boston.
And if I could just shout out, say that people in Cambridge are very interested in the kinds of things that you're doing, and there are, that each of you is doing, and that there's a reason, I think, to follow up on this meeting with an opportunity to talk about what could we be doing here. I'm sure when the next panel comes up, there'll be some of that talk about the next issue to figure out ideas and the goals that we have here for fostering community.
I know.
And also, and I think, Robert, we need a sign in the campaign today to have a follow-up conversation as it and I want to thank Mark for being another one of our 10 counselors looking after the interest of Cambridge.
I say thank you to Tina, too. Tina emailed us all week to make sure that we had all we needed.